Detroit, a city of contrasts. Towering skyscrapers rise above a landscape of old industrial grit, and the lives within are as multifaceted as the streets themselves. Among them, the story of Miles Carter begins, shining like a flicker of light against the otherwise gray backdrop. Miles Carter, a 29-year-old police officer with a strong frame, sharp eyes, and an unwavering sense of duty, had quickly become a rising star within the Detroit Police Department. He was the first to dive into the toughest cases, with an instinct for detecting lies and a passion that few could match. In every internal meeting, his superiors praised his dedication, while his colleagues respected his clear-headedness. Yet behind that confident smile and determined demeanor, Miles felt something missing. For years, he had poured himself into his work. The thrill of solving a case, the rush of a successful bust, the endless pursuit of justice, these were the things that filled his days and nights. But, outside of his police work, his personal life was a different story. Miles often found himself alone, sitting in his modest apartment, surrounded by the echoes of a life too focused on the job. His friends had moved on, starting families or pursuing other passions. And although he loved his work, Miles couldn't shake the feeling that something more was waiting for him, some part of life he hadn't yet experienced. That all changed in 2014. It was a crisp autumn evening when he attended a local networking event for city officials, an event he usually would have skipped if it weren't for the persistent encouragement of a colleague. The room was full of city planners, lawyers, and business owners, all talking shop over wine and hors d'oeuvres. Miles, dressed in his sharpest suit but feeling out of place, sipped his drink and wandered from group to group, nodding politely but rarely engaging in deep conversation. Then he saw her, Tasha Simmons. She stood out from the crowd, not just because of her striking appearance but because of the confidence she carried. A woman in her early 30s, with a magnetic presence, Tasha had the kind of self-assurance that turned heads without trying. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, and she wore a simple but elegant dress, her smile warm but slightly mysterious. Tasha wasn't just beautiful, she was intriguing. As an event planner, she had a thriving career, organizing some of the city's most high-profile gatherings. But more than that, there was something about the way she moved through the room, as if she belonged in every conversation, as if she held secrets that no one else knew. When their eyes met, Miles felt an instant connection, a jolt that broke through the monotony of his routine life. He hesitated for a moment before walking over, unsure of what to say, but determined not to let this chance slip by. "Hey, I'm Miles. You work here, or are you just as bored as I am?" he joked, his tone light but sincere. Tasha laughed, a sound that was both genuine and infectious. "Bored? Not exactly. I planned this event, so I guess you could say I'm working." That was all it took. What started as a casual conversation quickly evolved into something more. They talked for hours, well beyond the end of the event, losing track of time as they delved into each other's lives. Tasha told him about her business, how she had built it from the ground up, and the challenges of balancing a high-profile career with a personal life. Miles shared stories from the field, his tough upbringing in the city, and his commitment to his work. There was a chemistry between them that neither could deny. They both felt it, a pull, a magnetic force that brought them together despite their different worlds. Over the following months, their relationship blossomed. By early 2015, they had moved in together. Miles had never felt so certain about someone before. With Tasha, it was different. She was his equal, a partner who understood the pressures of his job but also had her own ambitions and goals. For the first time in years, he felt like his life was complete. His colleagues would often comment on how happy he seemed, and even Tasha's friends, who were a tight-knit and discerning group, praised their relationship as picture-perfect. Tasha brought a new energy into Miles' life. They traveled when they could, exploring cities they'd both never been to, and spent countless nights talking about their dreams, their futures, and what they wanted from life. They were two people who had spent much of their adult lives focused on their careers but had now found something deeper, someone to share it all with. In June 2015, Miles decided to take the next step. On a warm summer evening, beneath the soft glow of city lights, he proposed. It wasn't an elaborate affair, just the two of them, alone in their favorite park, but it was perfect. Tasha said yes without hesitation, and by the end of the year, they were married in a small, intimate ceremony surrounded by close friends and family. From the outside, their lives seemed like a dream. Two successful professionals, thriving in their careers and deeply in love. But like any great love story, there were shadows lurking beneath the surface, secrets and tensions that neither of them could foresee. And as the months passed, those shadows began to grow. Tasha's behavior started to change. She became more distant, her once warm conversations now cold and brief. She would take long, secretive phone calls that left her visibly anxious. At first, Miles attributed it to stress. Tasha's business had grown rapidly, and he assumed the pressure was getting to her. But as time went on, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. Miles, ever the detective, noticed the small things, how she would avoid direct eye contact when he asked her about her day, or how she would leave the room when her phone rang. There were nights when she wouldn't come home until late, offering vague excuses that didn't quite add up. But despite his suspicions, Miles loved her deeply. He convinced himself that it was just a rough patch, something they would get through together. But he was wrong. What Miles didn't know was that Tasha was hiding something much more dangerous than he could have imagined. And that secret would soon unravel everything they had built together, setting them on a path toward a tragic and irreversible end. By early 2016, Miles couldn't deny that something was terribly wrong. The woman who had once been his partner in every sense of the word, who had brought light into his life, seemed to be slipping further away with each passing day. Tasha, once the confident, radiant force he fell in love with, had become distant, almost like a shadow of her former self. It started subtly, as these things often do. At first, it was the late nights at work, Tasha explaining that her event planning business was expanding, that she had more clients, bigger deals, and more pressure to keep everything running smoothly. Miles wanted to believe her. After all, he knew what it was like to be consumed by work. He understood the long hours, the unrelenting stress. But soon, her absences became more frequent, her excuses more hollow. She would come home late, sometimes well after midnight, looking tired and distracted. Miles, trying to be the supportive husband, would ask how her day went, only to be met with vague responses or terse dismissals. "It's just work, Miles. I'm exhausted," she would say, brushing past him and heading straight to bed without so much as a kiss goodnight. The warmth that had once defined their relationship seemed to evaporate in the face of growing tension. As the weeks wore on, it wasn't just the late nights that bothered Miles. Tasha had started taking phone calls in secret, her voice hushed as she stepped out of the room whenever her phone rang. The conversations, from what little he could overhear, were brief but tense, punctuated by long silences and occasional sharp responses. When he asked her about it, she would dismiss it quickly, telling him it was just a difficult client or a complicated project. But something in the pit of his stomach told him otherwise. Miles had spent his entire career honing his instincts, learning how to read people, to detect when someone was lying. And now, those same instincts were screaming at him. Something was wrong, and no matter how much he tried to push the thoughts away, they only grew louder with time. He wanted to confront Tasha, to demand answers, but every time he considered it, he hesitated. What if he was wrong? What if this was all just a misunderstanding? Still, the doubt gnawed at him. He began to notice other things, small details that only fed his suspicion. Tasha had started withdrawing large sums of money from their joint account, something she had never done before. When he asked her about it, she brushed it off, saying she needed the funds for work-related expenses. But the amounts were too large, too frequent, and there was no sign of any major projects on the horizon. Their once strong connection now felt strained, the easy conversations replaced with awkward silences and thinly veiled tension. Every time they sat down to dinner, Miles found himself searching her face for answers, for some clue as to what was going on behind those guarded eyes. But Tasha remained elusive, and the more she pulled away, the more desperate Miles became to understand what was happening. By mid-2016, the situation had reached a breaking point. Tasha's behavior grew more erratic. She would disappear for hours at a time, often without explanation. When she was home, she was distant, her mind seemingly elsewhere. Miles, consumed by his suspicions, began to wonder if she was having an affair. It was the only explanation that made sense to him. Why else would she be so secretive, so guarded? Why else would she avoid him at every turn? One evening, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Miles decided to follow her. It was a decision he would later regret, but in that moment, he felt like he had no other choice. Tasha had left the house earlier than usual, dressed in a way that caught his attention, more formal, more deliberate. She hadn't said where she was going, only that she had business to take care of. Miles waited a few minutes after she left, then grabbed his keys and quietly followed her into the night. He kept his distance as she drove across town, his heart pounding in his chest. The drive took them to a part of the city he didn't recognize, far from the upscale neighborhoods where Tasha usually conducted her business. When she finally parked, it was outside a rundown bar on the edge of town, a place Miles would never have expected her to go. From the safety of his car, he watched as Tasha stepped out and walked toward the entrance. She glanced around nervously before disappearing inside. Miles hesitated for a moment, debating whether to follow her in, but something told him to wait. After several tense minutes, the door swung open, and a man stepped out, tall, rough-looking, with a face that screamed trouble. The man, whose name Miles would later learn was Marcus Dixon, didn't look like a client, or even a colleague. He looked like a threat. As Marcus lit a cigarette and scanned the parking lot, Miles saw Tasha emerge behind him. The two exchanged a few hurried words, and then Tasha handed him something, an envelope, thick with what could only be cash. Marcus stuffed it into his pocket, nodded curtly, and walked away. Miles watched in stunned silence. This wasn't an affair, but it was something far worse. His mind raced with questions, none of which had easy answers. What was Tasha doing with this man? Why was she giving him money? And why had she been hiding it from him? As Tasha got back into her car and drove away, Miles sat in the darkness, his world unraveling around him. He had followed her expecting to catch her in the arms of another man, but instead, he had stumbled onto something far more dangerous. He didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a much darker chapter in their lives, one that would lead them both down a path of secrets, lies, and ultimately, tragedy. With each passing day, the distance between them grew wider, and Miles' suspicion deepened. The woman he had married, the woman he had once trusted with his life, was now a stranger. And no matter how much he tried to pull her back, she continued to slip further and further away. The discovery that night outside the bar left Miles in a state of turmoil. Every instinct he had honed as a police officer screamed at him to dig deeper, to uncover the truth. But this wasn't just another case, this was his wife, the woman he loved. The thought of confronting her directly sent a wave of fear and confusion crashing over him. What could he even say? What explanation would she give? For days after that night, he found himself spiraling, unable to focus on his work. The tension between them had grown into an unbearable weight. Tasha continued her routine of secrecy, late nights, hushed phone calls, disappearing without notice, but now Miles saw everything through a new lens. Each glance, each avoided question felt like a new wound. It was as if they were living two separate lives, only occasionally crossing paths in their shared home, but always under the shadow of unspoken truths. One evening, after days of silence between them, Miles decided that enough was enough. He needed answers. He couldn't live like this any longer, constantly questioning, constantly doubting. He waited until Tasha had gone to bed and slipped into the living room, her phone still on the coffee table where she had left it earlier. His heart raced as he reached for it, knowing full well that this could be the moment everything changed. Unlocking her phone was easy, he had watched her enter the code 1,000 times. Once inside, he hesitated, guilt washing over him. This wasn't how a marriage was supposed to be. They had built their relationship on trust, on honesty. And yet here he was, violating that very trust in the hope of finding some semblance of truth. But deep down, he knew there was no other choice. He began scrolling through her messages, most of them benign conversations with clients or friends. But then he saw it, a string of messages from an unknown number, sent over the course of several weeks. As he opened the conversation, a chill ran down his spine. The messages were full of threats, demands for money, and accusations. Whoever was texting Tasha wasn't a client or a friend. This person was blackmailing her. One message stood out from the rest, sent just a few days earlier. $50,000. You know what happens if you don't pay up. I'm not waiting anymore. His heart pounded in his chest as he scrolled through the messages, piecing together the story. This wasn't just about money, this was about something far more personal, something Tasha had been hiding from him for years. The name Marcus came up multiple times, always accompanied by threats, always demanding more money. Miles dropped the phone, his hands shaking. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Marcus, the man he had seen outside the bar, the man who had taken that envelope from Tasha, was blackmailing her. But why? What could Tasha possibly have done to warrant this level of desperation? Overwhelmed, Miles paced the living room, trying to calm himself down. He couldn't confront her, not yet. He needed more information, more answers. But his heart was breaking. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted with his life, had been keeping secrets, dangerous secrets. And now those secrets were threatening to tear them apart. In the following days, Miles' suspicion grew into an obsession. Every moment he wasn't at work, he was thinking about Tasha, about Marcus, about the messages. He couldn't concentrate, couldn't sleep. His mind was consumed with the need to uncover the full truth. But how? Confronting Tasha outright might push her further away, or worse, drive her into Marcus's hands. No, he needed to tread carefully. One evening, after Tasha had gone out again, Miles decided to take the investigation into his own hands. He called in a favor from a colleague in the police department, someone he trusted implicitly. Without giving too many details, he asked his friend to run a background check on Marcus Dixon, the man he had seen outside the bar. His colleague hesitated. This was a favor that could get them both in trouble, but eventually agreed, under the promise that it would remain strictly off the record. A few days later, the report came back, and it was worse than Miles could have imagined. Marcus Dixon had a long criminal history, mostly petty crimes, drug dealing, theft, assault, but there was one piece of information that stood out. Years ago, Marcus had been connected to a small but notorious gang operating in Detroit, one known for extortion and blackmail. The gang had since disbanded, but Marcus had remained involved in the criminal underworld, occasionally working as a fixer for people with dirty secrets. And then there was the final blow, an old case file from nearly a decade ago that mentioned Marcus's association with a woman named Tasha Simmons. Miles's heart sank as he read the file. Tasha wasn't just a victim in this. She had known Marcus long before they had met, back when she was living under a different name. The report didn't go into detail, but it was clear that she had been involved with Marcus in some capacity, perhaps even romantically. It was unclear exactly what had happened between them, but whatever it was, it had been buried in her past. Until now. Armed with this new information, Miles knew he couldn't wait any longer. The confrontation he had been avoiding for so long was inevitable. He had to know the full truth. That night, as Tasha returned home, her face worn and tired, Miles sat waiting for her in the living room. His hands clenched into fists, his mind racing with questions. "Tasha," he began, his voice steady but cold, "we need to talk." She froze in the doorway, her eyes widening as she sensed the shift in his tone. She knew, in that moment, that there was no escaping what was about to happen. "What's going on, Miles?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. He stood, holding her phone in his hand, the messages from Marcus still open on the screen. "You've been lying to me. About everything." Tasha's face drained of color as she took a step back. "I can explain." "No, Tasha," Miles interrupted, his voice rising, "I don't want any more lies. I know about Marcus. I know about the blackmail. And I know that you've been hiding something from me, something big. So, start talking." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of them. Tasha's lips trembled as she struggled to find the words. The secret she had worked so hard to keep hidden was about to come crashing down, and there was no turning back now. Tasha's hands trembled as she stood before Miles, the truth she had fought so hard to conceal now teetering on the edge of exposure. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but she knew there was none. The moment she had dreaded for so long had finally arrived, and there was no more running, no more hiding. Miles stood across from her, his face a mask of pain, betrayal, and barely contained fury. The man who had once loved her unconditionally was now staring at her with eyes full of suspicion and rage. "Tasha," he said again, his voice strained, "tell me everything." Tasha swallowed hard, her throat tight with fear. She had always known this day might come, but she had convinced herself she could keep her past buried, that Miles would never find out. Now, she realized how foolish that hope had been. Slowly, she sank into the armchair across from him, her head lowered in shame. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she whispered. "I didn't want to lie to you, but I didn't know how else to protect myself." "Protect yourself from what?" Miles asked, his voice sharp. "From me? From the truth?" Tasha hesitated for a moment before finally meeting his gaze. "From Marcus. From the mistakes I made before we met." The weight of her words hung in the air, and Miles's heart pounded as he listened, his anger momentarily tempered by confusion. He took a step forward, his voice quieter but no less intense. "What mistakes, Tasha? What did you do?" She closed her eyes, struggling to find the courage to continue. "Before I met you, before I became Tasha Simmons, I was someone else. I was involved with Marcus. He wasn't just a random criminal, he was my ex. I left him, and I left that life behind. I thought I was free, but he tracked me down." Miles's mind reeled. His wife had been involved with Marcus Dixon, a known criminal. His pulse quickened as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but the revelation was almost too much to process. "You were with Marcus," he repeated, the disbelief clear in his voice. "Why didn't you tell me this? Why didn't you trust me?" Tasha looked down, her hands gripping the armrests of the chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I was ashamed, Miles. I didn't want you to know about that part of my life. I thought if I could just get rid of Marcus, if I could pay him off, it would all go away. I was trying to protect us." "Protect us?" Miles snapped, his frustration boiling over. "You were paying him $50,000 to keep quiet, Tasha. That's not protecting us, that's lying. What else have you been hiding?" Tears welled up in her eyes as she shook her head, her voice barely audible. "Nothing. Just Marcus. He threatened to tell you everything if I didn't pay him. He said he'd ruin my life. Our life." The room fell into a tense silence, both of them caught in the gravity of the situation. Miles felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under him. The woman he had built his life with, the woman he had trusted more than anyone, had been lying to him since the beginning. He didn't know what to do with that kind of betrayal, didn't know how to make sense of it. But beneath the hurt, beneath the anger, was something darker, something dangerous. A storm was brewing inside him, and he could feel it rising, threatening to consume him. The sense of control he had always prided himself on was slipping, and he didn't know how to stop it. Tasha, sensing the shift in his demeanor, stood up and moved toward him, her hands outstretched in a plea. "Miles, please, I didn't want any of this. I love you. I was trying to protect our future." "Don't," he cut her off, his voice shaking with barely restrained fury. "Don't say you were protecting me. You've been lying to me for years, and now you expect me to just, what? Forgive you?" Tasha stepped back, fear flashing in her eyes as she realized just how precarious the situation had become. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I swear, I thought I could fix this." But Miles wasn't hearing her anymore. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, each one darker and more consuming than the last. All he could think about was the deception, the betrayal. The love they had shared, the future they had dreamed of together, now seemed like a cruel joke. Before he knew what he was doing, Miles grabbed her by the arm, his grip tight, his breathing heavy. "How could you do this to me?" he shouted, his voice raw with emotion. "How could you lie to me like this?" Tasha gasped, trying to pull away, her heart racing in panic. "Miles, please, you're hurting me." But the sound of her voice, the fear in her eyes, only seemed to fuel his rage. In that moment, he felt as if he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and with one more step, he would fall into the abyss. And then, in a blinding flash of anger, he struck her. The room seemed to freeze in that instant. Tasha stumbled backward, her hand flying to her cheek in shock, her eyes wide with disbelief. Miles, too, stood frozen, his hand still raised, his chest heaving. The reality of what he had just done slammed into him like a freight train, and all the anger that had consumed him moments ago was replaced by a crushing sense of horror. "Tasha," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean to. But it was too late." Tasha's eyes filled with tears as she turned to run, her hands still clutching her face. In her haste, she tripped over the edge of the coffee table, her body falling hard against the floor. There was a sickening thud, followed by a terrible, eerie silence. Miles stood frozen in place, his mind unable to process what had just happened. His breath came in shallow gasps as he slowly knelt down beside her, his hands trembling as he reached out. "Tasha," he whispered, his voice hoarse with panic. "Tasha, please." But she didn't respond. Her body lay still, the life draining from her far too quickly. "No. Miles gasped, tears streaming down his face as the weight of what he had done finally crushed him. No, no, no. He tried to shake her, to bring her back, but deep down, he knew it was futile. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The woman he had loved, the woman he had once sworn to protect, was gone. And there was nothing he could do to change that. As the reality of the situation set in, Miles collapsed beside her, his body racked with sobs. His mind raced through the events of the past few months, the lies, the secrets, the anger. None of it mattered now. All that remained was the horrible, irreversible truth: he had killed her. The next morning, a concerned neighbor knocked on the door, having heard the commotion the night before. When there was no response, she called the police. By the time they arrived, Miles was still sitting on the floor next to Tasha's body, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He didn't resist when they arrested him. In fact, he barely spoke at all. The case quickly became a media sensation, with every detail of their lives and Tasha's hidden past splashed across the headlines. Miles was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, his once promising career shattered, his life ruined. As he sat in his prison cell, haunted by the memory of that terrible night, Miles couldn't help but wonder how it had all gone so wrong. The love that had once brought him so much happiness had now become his greatest tragedy. And in the end, all that was left were the secrets they had kept, the lies they had told, and the irreversible consequences of their choices.